I've completed my review of the officer-involved shooting from September 5th of 2015. My review consisted of reviewing the Virginia Beach Police Department's investigation into the matter, as well as my office's own independent review and investigation into it. I think it's important to state up front that the purpose of my review is not to examine police tactics or procedures. The purpose of my review is solely to determine whether or not a crime was committed by the police officers when they discharged their firearm on September 5th. So I'm going to go through my findings, and then I'll be happy to take questions at the end. I think it's important that we all understand how it is that the SWAT team and the vehicle driven by India Kager with Angelo Perry in it ended up at that 7-Eleven parking lot on September 5th of 2015. The Virginia Beach Police Department was investigating 2 murders and a home invasion, robbery, malicious wounding charge, 3 separate offenses that they were investigating, 3 separate events. When they were approached by a confidential informant in the end of August of 2015, the informant shared with them information that the individual responsible for those offenses was a person by the name of Blesseye. The Virginia Beach Police Department looked into that name and were able to determine that that was actually Angelo Perry. Angelo Perry had been previously convicted here in Virginia Beach of malicious wounding. He had also been convicted of use of a firearm and commission of a felony, and also assault and battery of a law enforcement officer. He was actually still on probation and had only been released from prison in 2014. He was still on probation for the malicious wounding and the use of the firearm charge. He quickly became the main suspect in those 2 murder charges and the home invasion event. The confidential informant came back to the detectives on September 4th. At that point in time, he informed them that a Virginia Beach resident was the subject of a hit, that a hit had been put out on this Virginia Beach resident, that the Blesseye or Angelo Perry had agreed to commit this murder, and that he would be coming from Maryland down to Virginia Beach probably within the next day to do just that. The Virginia Beach Police Department tried several times to make contact with the intended victim of that murder and were unsuccessful in doing so. As a result, they sought, under the statutory authority to do so, permission to begin to ping or track Angelo Perry's cell phone so that they could try and determine a general location of where he was. Over the course of the next day into September 5th, they began to see that Angelo Perry's phone was moving from Maryland down towards Virginia Beach. It was determined at that point in time, since they were unable to reach the victim, that they would monitor Angelo Perry when he arrived in the city of Virginia Beach, and if he were in fact to attempt to commit a further act of violence, that they would try to stop him. They subsequently received information that night that Angelo Perry had arrived at the Scarborough Square neighborhood here in Virginia Beach. In addition to the fact that he was present there, they were also told by their informant that Angelo Perry was armed with handguns and that he was riding in a blue Cadillac with Maryland tags on it. Also, that there was suspicion that the murder of the intended victim, that he was coming here, that was to take place that evening. When Perry left the Scarborough Square neighborhood, at that point undercover officers began to follow the blue Cadillac when it left that neighborhood. The undercover detectives were able to confirm that Perry was in the passenger side of the vehicle, and they were able to state that there was a female driver in the vehicle who they did not know, and they believed that there was a possibility of a third individual in the back seat at that time. As they were following the Cadillac was moving from Scarborough Square towards the location of the intended victim's residence that supposedly Angelo Perry was here to murder. As they were following the Cadillac, the driving started to become erratic. And when I say erratic, while going up Lynnhaven Parkway, the vehicle would turn from the main traffic lanes into turn lanes, only to at the last second come back out onto the main lanes of Lynnhaven Parkway, making it extremely difficult for the undercover vehicles to be able to follow and monitor the blue Cadillac. Eventually, the Cadillac pulled into the Salem Crossing Shopping Center, went through the parking lot to behind the shopping center itself. There, the vehicle made a U-turn, came back out from behind the shopping center, and actually at that point passed several of the undercover vehicles with officers in there that had been following the blue Cadillac. It was at this point that the officers became aware of the fact and had come to the conclusion that Perry was aware of their presence and that he was being followed by the police. As the Cadillac left the parking lot, pulling into the connected 7-Eleven parking lot there on Lynnhaven Parkway, the determination was made by the police department at that point that they would stop Angelo Perry and take him into custody, since they had reliable information at that point that not only was he a convicted felon who was here to commit a violent act, but on top of that, that they had received reliable information that he was armed with handguns at that point. That in and of itself is a felony offense of a felon in possession of a handgun or firearm, and they had the legal authority to detain and take him into custody at that point. The Cadillac pulls into the parking spaces there at the 7-Eleven. Two SWAT vehicles pull up behind the blue Cadillac. One of them makes contact with the rear of the Cadillac as they pull up. A flashbang distraction device is thrown by the officers to the front of the blue Cadillac vehicle, and as that is taking place, 5 SWAT officers come from the rear of the SWAT vehicle, moving up the passenger side of the blue Cadillac. The SWAT officers all had markings of police on them. In addition to that, they were all yelling, "Police, show me your hands." When the first officer in the line of the 5 officers got to Mr. Perry's window on the passenger side, the officer noticed that the window glass broke out towards him. The officers in the line at that point saw a handgun in Mr. Perry's hand and realized that he was firing at the officers. All of the officers realized at that point that Perry was firing at them. The first 4 officers returned fire. The 5th officer did not fire because he did not have a clear line of sight, could not see Mr. Perry, could not see the weapon, and he did not discharge his firearm. The first 4 officers did discharge their firearms. Perry was able to get off 4 rounds at the police. They returned 30 rounds of fire after he had fired upon them. They did not fire until Mr. Perry had shot at them first. They stopped firing their weapons when he eventually lowered the gun. He actually lowered his weapon without releasing it, and then eventually let go of it. But the officer stopped shooting when he did in fact lower his gun. What is very important to note at this point in time is that why this exchange of fire was going back and forth. Mr. Perry changed his position in the vehicle. He changed his position so that his feet were against the passenger door, and he had placed his back against India Kager, who was the driver of the vehicle, and against her and against the driver's seat, placing Miss Kager directly in the line of fire of the officers as he was shooting at them. As soon as the exchange of fire had ended, the police immediately came up, removed India Kager from the vehicle, and started to try and treat her wounds and give her CPR. Unfortunately, she died at the scene, as well as Mr. Perry was dead in the vehicle. It was at this point that the officers first realized that there was an infant in the back seat of the vehicle. Luckily, the infant was unharmed in the exchange of firefight. So, also, at the conclusion of the scene becoming secure, the conclusion of the exchange of fire between the officers and Mr. Perry, the first officer who had arrived up at the side window of Mr. Perry, when he saw the glass breaking out towards him, began to examine his uniform and learned that a bullet had gone through his uniform and had gone through his undershirt, but did not actually strike his body. So these are the events that occurred. My analysis then of the law brings me to taking a look at the officer's actions on that evening. And I will explain that in a police-involved shooting, the officer's actions have to be determined to be objectively reasonable in the light of the facts and circumstances confronting the officers at the time. Well, the facts and circumstances confronting the officers on September 5th were very clear. Angelo Perry was a felon convicted multiple times of violent offenses. He had previously been convicted of using a firearm in the commission of a felony. The police had received reliable information that he was armed when he left the Scarborough Square neighborhood, therefore committing a new felony offense of felon in possession of a firearm. He was the main suspect in 2 murder investigations and a home invasion robbery malicious wounding investigation, which, as previously released by Virginia Beach Police Chief Severa, a ballistics analysis performed on the 2 firearms found in the vehicle with Perry confirmed that those weapons were used in the 2 murder investigations in the home invasion robbery malicious wounding investigation. The police had received reliable information that Perry was in town for the purpose of committing a murder, and they were moving in the direction of the intended victim's residence. The officers had sufficient reasonable suspicion to stop Perry at that point in time and take him into custody if they found him to be in possession of firearms. It was Mr. Perry who chose to change the circumstances that night when he opened fire on the police. The SWAT officers' uniforms and tactical gear were clearly marked police. They identified themselves as law enforcement by yelling, "Police, show me your hands," repeatedly as they approached Perry. Perry still chose to open fire rather than surrender. Now, I know that you hear that 4 rounds are fired by Mr. Perry and 30 rounds are returned by the police officers. I do not find the 30 rounds to be excessive in any way. And let me explain why. Number one, you have 4 officers who are shooting. Number two, the United States Supreme Court has specifically told us if police officers are justified in firing at a suspect in order to end a severe threat to public safety, the officers need not stop firing until the threat has ended. The officers started shooting once Perry shot at them. They stopped shooting once Perry lowered his weapon. Based on the substantial evidence in this case and the law of this matter, I've come to the conclusion that the 4 Virginia Beach police officers involved in the shooting that night on September 5th did not violate the law and will not be prosecuted for any criminal offenses related to the death of Angelo Perry. India Kager is a different situation than Angelo Perry's. There is absolutely no information that India Kager was participating in the illegal activity that Mr. Perry was committing. The examination then of Miss Kager's death is different than that of Perry's. However, the examination begins with whether the officers were justified in discharging their firearms at Perry. As we've already discussed, Perry opened fire on them. They were within their legal rights to return fire to protect themselves, their fellow officers, and any citizens that were out at the scene at that time. So they were justified in firing their weapons. So when it comes to the death of Miss Kager, all of the officers were aiming their fire at Mr. Perry. None of the officers targeted Miss Kager. In fact, what is perfectly clear after reviewing all of the evidence is that it was Perry that placed Miss Kager and their child in danger. Rather than surrendering to the clearly marked police officers who were yelling, "Police, show me your hands," he chose to draw a firearm and shoot at the officers, knowing that Miss Kager was sitting next to him and knowing that their child was in the back seat of the vehicle. In addition to that, it was Mr. Perry who turned his body and positioned it in such a manner that he placed Miss Kager directly in the officer's line of fire. There is a very interesting note that I think was significant in the medical examiner's autopsy of Miss Kager. It says the 10 bullet defects identified at autopsy may have been produced by 7 or 8 bullets. A number of the entrances are atypical, and some of these may represent re-entry from bullets that exited the adjacent victim, Perry. However, these may also represent bullets which perforated glass or portions of the vehicle. Therefore, the number of bullets which struck the decedent after striking the adjacent Perry cannot be determined by the autopsy. So what the medical examiner is explaining to us is they are unable to determine what, if any, of the bullets that hit Miss Kager actually passed through Mr. Perry and into Miss Kager as a result of him positioning his body in that fashion. It was these decisions by Mr. Perry and not the actions of the officers that resulted in Miss Kager's death. As a result, again, due to the substantial evidence collected in this matter and my review of the law, I find that the officers did not violate the law, were legally justified in their actions on that evening, and there will be no criminal charges against any of the 4 police officers regarding the death of India Kager. This is an extremely traumatic set of circumstances to have happened in our city. Traumatic for the Perry family, traumatic for the Kager family, but also very traumatic for the officers involved. My heart goes out to absolutely everybody involved in this matter, and it truly can be described as nothing other than tragic for all involved.